Hostem dnešního Interview Plus je Timothy Snyder, americký historik a přední expert na novodobé dějiny střední a východní Evropy z americké Yaleovy univerzity a z Vídeňského institutu pro humanitní vědy, kde rozhovor natáčíme. Hello and thank you for accepting invitation to our program.
Glad to speak to you.
Czech parliamentary election will take place exactly in 100 days. In recent years, there has been much evidence of Russia's attempts to intervene, for example, in the US presidential elections, or to influence voting through disinformation campaigns and so on. To what extent are elections still fair competition today, and how much are they influenced by these various external interventions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think having elections that are fair competitions should be an aspiration of every democracy. So whether it's the Czech Republic or whether it's the United States, we should be thinking, what are the internal conditions that we need to have competitive elections? And in both of our countries, there's an issue there with free speech and so on. The external issue becomes worse when you have internal problems, because the way that external actors behave is that they look for the weaknesses in the system. They look for the divisions in the society. So the best way to hold off external intervention is to try to solve as many problems internally as you can.
So should we in the Czech Republic be afraid of something like that, or the fact that we are not so important players, international players, as United States, UK or Germany, which have been the targets of this intervention in recent years, that save us? Let's say.
No. It's completely the other. I would say it's the other way around. That in general, Russia experiments with smaller countries and then it tries things with bigger countries. So there is a Russian disinformation presence in the Czech Republic, and Russia certainly has its favorites among Czech politicians. So no, I think it's the other way around. I think it's rather accidental that the United States was such a success for Russia. I don't think they expected that it would work so well in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And what was the reason that it was such a success? It was a person of Donald Trump, or what was it?
I think they got lucky in three ways. I mean, as you say, number one, Donald Trump was a perfect candidate for them, because Donald Trump is someone who, morally speaking, is a complete nihilist. And although you have many terrible politicians in your country, and I have many terrible politicians in mine, it's hard to find someone who is a complete moral vacuum. And Mr. Trump is a complete moral vacuum. You have to find someone who doesn't care at all about foreign intervention, who thinks it's good if there's foreign intervention, so long as it's on his side. So that's number one. Number two, they got lucky because of the media environment. It was a moment in the United States in 2016 when people simply hadn't realized how important Facebook is, and also how unreliable Facebook is. And the third way they got lucky was that they were working with a society which was already very polarized. So in the American debate in 2016, people were so much against one of the candidates, right? It was all about being against one of the candidates. And when you're against someone, as opposed to being for some kind of a program, then you might believe the terrible things that are said about them. So in this environment, Russia's involvement, especially the theft and release of emails, was very effective.
Mm. You said that we in the Czech Republic have some terrible politicians. Could you name some? Or who, in your opinion, is a terrible politician in Czech Republic?
I think it's normal that all countries have terrible politicians. But if we're speaking about the information space and about Russia, I mean, I would say that your president would be near the top of the list. I mean, that he's someone who is worse than naive about Russia and exhibits, to my way of thinking, a terrible attitude about the press. I mean, the elections without a free press are essentially just a ceremony in which power maintains its previous role. So Everyone has terrible politicians, everyone can have terrible presidents, but if we're talking about Russia and free speech, I guess there's an easy answer in your country.
When we look beside the Czech Republic, what about Europe? You said that Russia was lucky with Donald Trump as a candidate. Are there such a candidates, let's say, in Europe, which can be so dangerous for the situation in Europe, in European Union? I think about the next French election. What about Marine Le Pen and these kind of politicians?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a long-term issue and there's a short-term issue. I mean, for me, the long-term issue which worries me is Germany. The most important country in Europe is Germany, and the Germans generally say sensible things about Russia and sensible things about Ukraine, but they're setting themselves up to be dependent upon Russian gas, and they're doing so for reasons which I frankly have a hard time understanding. So I'm speaking about Nord Stream 2, of course. I don't understand what German policymakers are thinking when they basically reward Russia for invading Ukraine by helping to build a pipeline which allows Russia to sell gas around Ukraine. I don't understand that morally, I don't understand it geopolitically. I worry about the long-term effects of that. In the short term, as you say, there are all kinds of important political forces in Europe which don't have universalistic and don't have transatlantic conceptions. And you've just named one, Marine Le Pen in France. And Marine Le Pen also has been in the past surrounded by advisors who took a very radically pro-Russian view of international affairs. But in the end, I don't think let me say one more thing. I don't think it comes down to particular people or even particular political parties. It comes down to the ability of citizens to make an argument for their own democracy, because Russian propaganda only goes in one direction. Russian propaganda says this is all nonsense, only power matters, there are no values in the world, everybody cheats, everybody lies, everybody steals. Why should you care about human rights? It's a fiction. Why should you care about democracy? It's a joke, right? Russian propaganda is only destructive. It's not constructive. They're not offering any view of the world. They're not offering any positive project. They're just saying, look, you know and I know that all of this is just a joke. And so for me, the larger question is, can Europe produce political parties? Can Europe produce political actors? Can Europe produce citizens who are willing to say, actually, democracy is a very good thing, and actually human rights are real and they matter, and actually there is such a thing as the truth, right? Like ultimately that's the way that you defend yourself.
And why people don't buy it, or not so many people, and the Russian propaganda is, let's say, more successful to convince people with these various theories and destructive theories. Why it is so? For example, is it also the support of social medias that help them to convince people and to do this politics?
Yeah. Well, so they're as I said before, the Russians are very good at figuring out how to use other people's weaknesses. And the entire social media environment is a weakness, right? The entire social media environment is an attack surface. It's a way for outsiders to get in. And it's not just an attack surface because it's so permeable, it's an attack surface because the software is designed to find its way to the point where you're stupid, right? That's not a bug, right? That's a feature. It's designed to find its way through our reasoning minds and down into the things that we fear, right? Down into the things which push our buttons. And so if you're an external actor, the software is already doing 90% of the work for you. You just have to insert your own things that people should be afraid about. So the social media is a huge part of it, and related to, I know I keep coming back to this, but related to this is a decline of the press. That if you don't have local and regional newspapers, not to mention national newspapers, if you don't have a lot of reporters who are covering real facts around people's lives, that creates a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled by social media, and then social media is dominated by whoever is the cleverest with it and who can spend the most money. But there's more to it than that. Democracy and the truth both depend on the future. So if you want people to believe that democracy matters, you have to let them know why it matters, why they're voting. And even truth, like if you want people to believe in truth, you have to say, well, if you believe in this, you can achieve this. For most people, truth is practical, right? So if you believe in truth, you can believe in these facts. Those facts will help you improve your life. So part of what's lacking in both Europe and the US is a future, right? A sense of the future. So the Czech Republic is an independent state, wonderful. The European Union exists, wonderful. But what next? Right? What's the story about how things will be wonderful in the 21st century? I think that creates a huge weakness, which the Russians exploit.
Mm-hmm. Besides medias, can help all these current efforts to regulate social medias or to implement codes of conduct and these kind of things. Can it prevent all these negative effects too, or it's not a say efficient tool?
Well, I mean, let me say three things there. Number one, this is an example of why the European Union is a very good thing, because no small country on its own can deal with social media, right? The Czech Republic cannot deal with Facebook. Norway can't deal with Facebook, but European countries together can deal with Facebook and have a chance. The second point is a more historical one. Any new medium takes a while before we figure out how it should work, and that's normal. So when the book was invented, look, we're surrounded by books. We're in a library. We think books are wonderful. Books are very peaceful objects. We sit quietly with books. But for the first 150 years of the book brought about religious warfare, right? So the printing press destabilized Europe and led to the death of as much as a third of the population. A lot of people died in religious wars. So what I'm trying to say is that it's normal that the internet is very confusing at first. It's also normal that you figure out what you're going to do with it. So with books, we have authors, we have copyright, right? There are rules, but they weren't there at the beginning. And something similar has to happen with the internet. The idea that it's just this free libertarian space is nonsensical. Every new medium has to take some kind of a shape. That's normal. And the third thing I wanted to say here is that you can't do this without education. So one thing which really worries me is this tendency of Europeans to watch the Americans make a mistake and then to do exactly the same thing 20 years later. So I don't know about the Czech Republic, but in much of Europe this is happening. We digitalize our schools, and it's a failure. It's a terrible idea. It's bad. And now the Europeans think, okay, we have to keep up with the Americans by digitalizing our schools. And actually it would be better to just not do that at all and just keep computers out of the classroom entirely, except for one class where you teach kids how to program.
So you are old school teacher.
New old school.
New old school.
No, I mean, I'm coming from the position of someone who was a computer programmer at the very beginning, who's not hostile to software, but who I think I understand it a little bit. And because I understand it a little bit, that helps me to educate people. I mean, I think education has to be about people helping people. And you have to educate kids so that they can deal with the world first before you put the screen in front of them.
Back from digital space to the Central Europe. Central Europe historically functioned as such a buffer zone between Germany and Russia. What is its role today when it's a member of European Union, NATO?
Well, history never ends. I mean, it's nice to think that joining the European Union and NATO somehow means that life is over, there are no more challenges. But as we see, that's clearly not the case. And the struggle for democracy and the struggle for freedom is much less about territory now than it used to be, right? So it used to be about tanks and lines, and now it's much more about memes and minds. And I think in a strange way, the role of Central Europe is the same as it has been for much of the last 100 years, which is that it's a kind of experimental zone. So a lot of the things that happened in the West happen in Central Europe first, and then a more intense version, right? So, for example, tunnelage and oligarchy, right? That you had that first, right? That form of corruption. We are in a certain way moving in that direction in the United States. The cyber stuff we talked about before, that was very intense in Russia and Ukraine and Central Europe before it reached the United States. So I think the answer is that you're still a zone of experimentation, for better or for worse.
And what is experimenting now in the Central Europe? What is the feature that is tested on us?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's not just coming from the outside. Of course, it's also your own rulers. I mean, I think there's a kind of theory of democratic emptiness where you have elections and you have political parties, but somehow it's all empty, right? Somehow there aren't enough facts, there aren't enough values. They're just procedures. And the procedures, rather than revealing a reality or changing a reality, they just enforce the status quo. Hungary has gone very far in that direction, right? And Poland is moving slowly in that direction. And it's a model which Russia is the example of, right? You have elections, they just don't mean anything. They're just empty. So it's something like that. It's a kind of democratic emptiness, and it's sad and melancholy because it used to be that there were challenges, right? There were intellectual and moral challenges to democracy. They might have come from terrible places, but at least they embodied some kind of human ingenuity. Right now, it's empty democracy versus full democracy, and so the enemy of democracy is it's an absence. It's always in disguise. It's always taking something away. It's always criticizing. It's never adding anything.
Are you afraid that this empty democracy could be replicated also in Western Europe or in the United States, or all the old democracies, if you can call them so, that don't allow it?
I'm not afraid of it. I'm watching it happen before my eyes. So it's happening in the United States. Right now, we have states that are passing election laws which will have exactly this consequence. People will vote, but their votes won't really count. What will really count is something else. The procedure will still be there, but the procedure doesn't really work. Life will become hollow. People will recognize that something isn't quite right, but they won't know what to do about it. At what point exactly do you say, this is not a real democracy? At what point do you rebel? It's very hard to know, because these changes can be gradual. But no, I'm not afraid of it because I'm not afraid of it happening in the future because it's happening now. When Mr. Trump said that he won an election that he lost, he began a process of undermining American democracy, which is continuing right now.
Mm-hmm. What can heal it, this situation?
Yeah, that's a profound question. I mean, I mentioned one thing already, which is the future. I don't think we can do without the future. So much of this hollowness has to do with the past, right? So all of these politicians in your country, Poland, Russia, in my country, Marine Le Pen for that matter, they all point back to the past. They all say, there was a time, the 1950s, the 1930s, who knows. There was a time which was better. There was a time which was simpler. There was a time when we knew who we are, right? They all do that. And that kind of politics works well when there's no future, when you don't know where you're going, or when you're afraid of the future. That's a big part of what we need, I think, to heal this. There has to be a European sense of the future. There has to be a Czech and an American sense of the future.
I would like to go also a little bit to the past, to the late Czech President Václav Havel, whom you quote very often in your books and return to his thoughts. after his decease, is the Czech Republic still the moral leader in the European or Central European area, or as it was in the period after the Velvet Revolution?
I mean, that's a tough question, which is really about the Czech Republic and not really about Europe or the rest of us. I mean, my view is that there was a moral competition between Václav Havel and Václav Klaus won, which isn't to say that I'm in favor of Václav Klaus, but I think if you look at the Czech Republic today, it's much more a Václav Klaus Czech Republic than it is a Václav Havel Czech Republic, and I say that with regret. But I think there was a political competition between two moral ideas, very different moral ideas. Havel's idea was something like horizontal community, the authenticity of individual personalities encountering one another, and politics being secondary, politics being about enabling people to live the lives that they authentically should live. Whereas for Klaus, politics was an instrument to create a certain kind of economic transformation. But that economic transformation was quite corrupt from the very beginning, and largely thanks to Mr. Klaus. And that, I think, has defined the Czech Republic morally. So I know you're asking about the rest of the world, and I'm answering you about the Czech Republic, but I'm afraid that that's the answer. Havel himself now, the Havel of the 1970s and 1980s, remains a giant. He remains an enormously important figure, and his analysis. I mean, when I reread his letter to Husak, or especially "Power of the Powerless," Mocny Mocných, when I reread that, I'm struck by how well it describes problems of Western democracy. So when he wrote that text, and I read it I read it first in the 1980s, and there's all this stuff at the end about how communist Czechoslovakia shows the problems that the West will have in the future. And when I read that in the 1980s, I had no idea what he was talking about. It seemed ridiculous to me. But now, it actually seems prophetic and accurate, because Havel was very much concerned about the mechanization of things. He was concerned about things becoming predictable, right? Whereas he understood freedom to be about unpredictability, improbability. He was worried about a social machine which forces us into what he calls the most probable states. That's how he defines repression, that you're being forced to do these things which are likely, right, which are probable. And freedom is about recognizing the unpredictable, beautiful, authentic thing in yourself. That, for me, is a profound analysis which doesn't just concern Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. It's very much about the West and all of us today, where there is now a big machine, right? There is now an internet, and it does tend to make us less interesting. All of us less interesting. And when you're less interesting, it's very hard to support a civil society, and it's very hard to support a democracy. So Havel, Havel remains a very important figure for our times.
Other very important line of his politics was this human rights dimension of the politics. Is it still present in current European politics, this human rights dimension, and how important it is? Or this, as you said, or this technocrats take upper hand over the human rights?
It's present. It's certainly present, but it lacks. It's a good question. I mean, it's present, right? But so let's take the example of the kidnapping of Roman Protasevich, right? So, on the one hand, this is a human rights violation, but on the other hand, it's a problem for European practices and globalization. And I'm glad that the European Union responded to the hijacking of the airplane. But at the same time, I look at it and I say, yes, Protasevich is a very important person. He did very important things, but he's one of hundreds of Belarusian journalists who have been oppressed in some way. He's one of tens of thousands of Belarusians who have been detained and in some way abused by the system in the last few months. So that case draws particular attention, though, because it's about airspace and about an airplane and about things that Europeans and prosperous people in general are used to taking for granted. And I understand them. I get that. I also don't want to get on an airplane and have it brought down by a Belarusian MiG. I understand. But I'm just trying to accept the premise of your question that it would be good if the human rights issues were easier to define on their own, right? It would be good if that human rights language were more central than it is now. I think in the Cold War, it was simpler for many people in the West because they could look to the East and say, well, you know, if a Ukrainian dissident is in the Gulag, that's a human rights violation. That's simple. Whereas now the world is much blurrier, and you know the things, and it's hard to say, you know, what's up and what's down, what's east and what's west, and it's hard to say with clarity, aha, this is wrong. People have a harder time with that. I mean, Belarus gives people a chance to say this is wrong because the repressions are so clear, and there's no ideological or political justification for them, right? And so Belarus is a good test of what you ask, and I think Belarus shows that the human rights language is there, and there are good and courageous people who use that language, but I wish it were more prominent than it is.
Uzavírá host dnešního Interview Plus, americký historik a jeden z předních znalců novodobých středoevropských a východoevropských dějin Timothy Snyder. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.
S vámi se loučí Filip Nerad.